Okay, so for this class, we are talking about the idea of civil disobedience in the United States. For the class, I've selected a number of readings, including Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience, the Declaration of Sentiments by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a very clever reworking of or rewriting of the Declaration of Independence. Some speeches by Frederick Douglass, including probably his most famous speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," as well as Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. Now, of those readings, the one I'm probably going to focus on the most during class will be um, King's letter from Birmingham jail. And I think it offers a sort of interesting point of departure for us to really sort of weigh in this idea of natural law and justice and how we really understand these things. Okay, so what is civil disobedience, broadly speaking? It could be defined as a nonviolent, deliberate, and conscientious violation of the law or established rules of government or authority carried out as a means of protest or to bring about social or political change. Protests are not necessarily civil disobedience since they are protected under the First Amendment. When does it become disobedience? Marching without a permit, for example, occupying public spaces without permission, blocking streets or government buildings as part of the protest. So once you sort of cross that line to breaking the law, you are basically engaging in civil disobedience. Key examples of this, this has been an important, tactic used by social movements throughout the history of the United States, including the abolition and women's rights movements, the civil rights movements, the anti-war movement, and other movements for social justice as well. That's why, understanding the notion of justice is very important for understanding this as well, which we will go into more as the class proceeds. But basically, I would situate this within a class on American government as being, an indispensable tool for understanding how the American government has basically changed over time, right? So we've covered the foundations of the American government in the early part of the class, but now obviously the government has changed. It's not a static entity by any stretch. But what has sort of driven this process of change? In large part, not exclusively, of course, but in many instances, it is because of civil disobedience being basically used against the government as a way of sort of forcing it to change, hopefully for the better. Um, Again, so civil disobedience has been used in the struggles to gain voting rights, ending segregation, legalizing same-sex marriage, changing public opinion on war, though admittedly maybe not necessarily ending wars, at least not right away, and for various environmental uh, legislation as well. Now, later on in the class, we'll sort of revisit this topic from another angle by sort of looking at the history of the civil rights movement and trying to understand social movements more broadly. Here, we're really more concerned specifically with this idea of civil disobedience. So, like I said, I mean, we'll really focus on King's letter from Birmingham Jail, where King really expertly lays out the idea of civil disobedience, sort of, provides a definitive sort of, philosophical argument for it, although not without some criticism as well, as I'll try to explore here. So you can see this is King's mugshot in Birmingham, which was one of the most violent episodes of the civil rights movement in 1963. So King is in Birmingham as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, which is still around to this day. He was invited here by the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights to assist with nonviolent action. Birmingham is one of the most segregated cities in the United States and had become sort of a front line in the civil rights movement. So his organizational ties give him legitimate reason to be there, but he says more fundamentally he is in Birmingham because injustice, as he says, is present. This is, responding to claims that King is an outside agitator and doesn't belong here and things like that, which is obviously a very um, disingenuous argument. Um, he states that there is an interconnectedness of justice. All communities and states are interconnected. You could possibly even expand this to talking about the world as well. Uh, Injustice anywhere, one of his famous phrases, is a threat to justice everywhere. So basically, anyone who sees an injustice going on, should have an obligation to, if they are able to sort of correct that injustice. So he, completely, rejects this idea of an outside agitator, which are still commonly used, right? I mean, people oftentimes, I remember, again, going back to the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, this was frequently a talking point used by, usually by city authorities, denouncing protesters, which they claim were coming from, outside the city or even different states and things like that, as if that is, a legitimate reason to, basically, suppress protests. So it's a common argument, a common tactic used by authorities. So King, in his letter, he sort of outlines, the steps in a nonviolent campaign. Collection of facts, determine, of course, if injustices exist. The next step after that is to negotiate with authorities, attempts to resolve issues through dialogue. If those attempts fail, however, of course, then you have to proceed to the next steps. He then refers to this idea of self-purification. He says to prepare mentally and spiritually for nonviolent action. So get yourself ready, get yourself psyched out, basically. And then engage in direct action. Use nonviolent methods to create tension and force negotiation. So it's a way of sort of, forcing recalcitrant elites, stubborn elites who are, refusing to change, ignoring attempts at dialogue. It's a way of sort of, forcing them to negotiations and basically forcing them to make concessions as well. So that is sort of the rationale behind these actions, behind what he refers to as direct action. King, of course, is very, very highly influenced by Thoreau, highly influenced by Gandhi, and as we'll see, by various other figures as well, including Socrates, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, and various others. Birmingham, again, is one of the most segregated cities in the United States. Its record includes brutality against Black citizens, unjust treatment in courts, numerous unsolved bombings of Black homes and churches, earning it the nickname Birmingham. Negotiations with city leaders failed, particularly to remove racist signs, whites only, things like that. And of course, this is several years after the landmark Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education. So even, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about the Supreme Court War. But even in the aftermath of things, as well as talking about the history of the Civil Rights Movement. So even in the aftermath of things like that, many southern cities were, refusing to, take down their segregated signs and things like that. So when negotiations with city leaders failed, again, they were forced to engage in this kind of direct action. So direct action creates what King calls constructive tension needed for negotiation. He claims it's inspired by the Socratic method, forcing society to confront uncomfortable truths, which is something that Socrates did. And if you know anything about the history of Socrates, or the story of Socrates, did not end well for him. Socrates was put on trial for corrupting the youth, convicted, and basically executed as a result of that. So because of that, has become sort of a symbol of this kind of struggle against unjust power. Again, forcing people to confront, as it says, uncomfortable truths here. Was known for his method of questioning people, forcing them to reveal the contradictions in their arguments. Did so, I guess, to enough prominent people in the city of Athens that he sort of earned their wrath, and again, things ended up the way that they did. Now, the goal of this constructive tension is to elevate understanding and brotherhood through pressure. So King recognizes that there's no way in which you can create, positive social change without bringing some kind of pressure on the part of authorities, which oftentimes uh, necessitates a person to break the law, basically, that you are in fact forced to because of the hard-headed stance of the city authorities or any kind of political authority. Again, King also addresses other criticisms against him, the idea that this is untimely, meaning, and this is another very relevant thing today as well. The idea, oh, that you're moving too fast, slow down, wait for things to change at a more moderate pace. King very strongly rejects that argument, and again, I think his arguments here are very relevant in current day debates that we see now. So King, responds to this idea that, oh, you're moving too fast, you're being too radical. He states correctly, of course, the new administration will not act without pressure. Um, Here he's talking about um, the city government, but also referring to government at various levels, state and federal as well. History shows that privileged groups rarely give up privileges voluntarily, which of course is true. People in power are not going to relinquish some of their power unless basically you force them to. But how do you force them to? King, envisions this as occurring through a nonviolent method, but one which still brings pressure. He says freedom must be demanded by the oppressed. It is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. Again, I'd like someone to give me one example where that has ever actually happened. Of course, it hasn't. Crucially, here he says the word "wait" has almost always meant never for Black Americans. So when people say "wait, slow down," things what will happen. You just got to be more patient. He's saying that that's a dishonest argument. And when people are telling you to slow down, they're basically just trying to pacify you to basically accept the status quo, which of course is never going to change. Again, unless this kind of pressure is brought to bear. Again, another famous quote by King here: "Justice too long delayed is justice denied." So if you wait too long, if you were just telling people that you just have to wait their turn, basically, it's just another way of basically denying people justice, as they say. Now, I wonder what examples people could think of to relate this to current day examples. So, for example, I would say, the debate over, healthcare, for example, would be certainly applicable here. Obviously, many other issues, related to racism still exist as well, and various other social ills. But oftentimes we're told that be patient. I mean, especially this was the kind of arguments being used during the passage of the Affordable Care Act. We know it's not great. We know it doesn't create single payer health care. It leaves millions of Americans uninsured. It doesn't really make health care affordable, as we've already talked about. Insurance premiums and things like that have skyrocketed basically since the law was passed. But just wait, just be patient, and things will come around eventually. I would say that's a very good example where you could apply this idea that no, I mean, this idea of just waiting around is just another way of basically, denying people of their rights. And next class, we'll talk more about this idea of rights, but, particularly this idea of social rights, which does include things like healthcare, education, housing, things like that, things which are basically not recognized as rights within the United States. But again, I mean, I'd be curious to hear what other people think of examples of this idea where people are trying to pacify you by saying, just wait, be patient, don't move too fast, things will happen eventually. And just using that as a way to sort of, short circuit these struggles for justice, basically. King, of course, does express concern about breaking the laws, but crucially here, and this is one of the most, philosophically probably the most important part of his letter here. There's a difference between what he says are just and unjust laws. So a just law, he says, aligns with moral law, also known as the natural law, and uplifts human personality. Unjust laws, he says, degrades human personality and are out of harmony with moral law or the natural law. He references St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, who support the moral obligation to disobey unjust laws. He quotes Augustine, who famously argues unjust laws are no laws at all. So if you break an unjust law, in a sense, you're not really breaking the law. I mean, you're breaking the laws as they're written down and passed by political authorities, but he's saying that those in a sense those laws are not real laws if they are basically unjust laws. Of course, you'll have a hard time, convincing the authorities of that. That's why these conflicts tend to play out the way that they do. But yeah, basically, he's saying that you can break unjust laws. Essentially, that is what he's saying. Segregation laws are unjust because they distort the soul and create the false senses of superiority and inferiority. King, of course, advocates for obeying just laws, like the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which, again, technically, the city authorities of Birmingham, Alabama, were breaking the law as well. So that's another aspect of it. They're the ones breaking the law, yet they are accusing, King and other protesters of breaking the law. Well, they're breaking an unjust law, which again, in a sense, is not a real law, while the city authorities of Birmingham are actually breaking a just law. So who's the greater villain here, essentially? So again, King advocates that you should obey just laws but disobey unjust laws. Of course, the key thing here is that how do you tell the difference between just laws and unjust laws, right? I think that's sort of the key philosophical question that kind of emerges out of this. Now, in instances of segregation, you might say it's fairly obvious. But how would you apply this to other situations as well? For example, I mean, if you refuse to pay certain types of debts, like medical debt, as I just said a moment ago. I mean, you would be accused in a sense of breaking the law. Um, but would you be disobeying then an unjust law, essentially? In a sense, is more of a contract than a law, I suppose you could say. But the laws essentially come into play. The legal system comes into play to sort of support these contractual agreements as well. Um, so on the idea of breaking an unjust law, King says it should be done openly, meaning not done in secret, be done lovingly, out of a spirit of love, not of malice, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. So even though you're breaking an unjust law, which in a sense is not a real law, there still comes, a penalty with doing that, and you should be willing to, accept the penalty for it, which is being, arrested in most cases. Civil disobedience aims to rouse the conscience of the community over injustice. King would argue the civil disobedience actually cultivates the highest respect for the law. And you see, by the way, Thoreau expressing very similar sentiments as well. Although I don't think we'll have much time to talk about his essay. Um, so we'll return to this idea of how do you tell the difference between a just law and an unjust law? Because I think in many ways that's sort of the key idea of this letter. But King references various historical examples of civil disobedience, taking examples from the Bible, early Christians facing persecution in Rome. Again, Socrates' defense of academic freedom, the Boston Tea Party, he even says. And although not mentioned by King, I think the play Antigone by Sophocles is kind of a key example of that as well. If you've never heard of the play, what it is basically is that Antigone is sort of conflicted by her duty to her city, which is basically because her brother was accused of committing treason against the city, is denied a burial, and basically Antigone takes it upon herself to bury her brother anyway, even though she is breaking the law. And in her defense, she says that basically, she is, once again, much like King argues, responding basically to a higher law, basically. That the law that she owes to her family is sort of higher than her obedience to the state, essentially. So I would think be a very key example of that you could reference as well. Now King also distinguishes between legality versus morality. So oftentimes things that are legal may not be moral, and vice versa. I think, again, I'd be curious to hear what example people can think of that things that are tolerated by the law, which seem to be clearly wrong. I'm sure we can think of many examples. King references Hitler. Hitler's actions in Germany were legal. Hitler came to power through mostly legal means. There were certainly some funny, you know, funny is probably not the right word to use, but the way he got into power was at least quasi legal. He was sort of elected into office, although there were, I think, pretty clear attempts at voter suppression and things like that, intimidating voters and things like that. But yes, he did, essentially come to power through a legal election. His seizure of power was preceded by laws being passed, which essentially gave him emergency powers. So in a certain sense, almost everything that he did, at least from the point of view of the German state, could be considered legal. Whereas at the same time, helping Jews living under Nazi Germany was considered illegal. A clear example of morality and legality being at opposite ends. And again, King, much like Antigone, argues that moral responsibility outweighs legality in cases of moral injustice. Advocates for civil disobedience under oppressive regimes. Another example he uses is a willingness to disobey anti-religious laws under communism as well. And King is also very critical of what he calls the white moderate. And I think to this you can nowadays add the black moderate as well. The black moderate who is, tied into the Democratic Party, may even serve in elected office or other, organizations outside of the government, who, he says are the greatest, or maybe just the moderate in general. Then we should say, which King says is the greatest obstacle to racial justice. These are the people who say, yes, we agree with, again, basically the people who say, we agree with you, but, slow down, don't be too radical. You got to wait your turn, basically. And he says that these people are even a greater obstacle than the people who are sort of outwardly, opposed to ending segregation. Why? Because they're kind of like false friends, right? They kind of pose and posture as your ally, but really behind the scenes, they're kind of working behind your back to sort of sabotage these movements. King says that they are more devoted to order than to justice. Order being, in quotation marks here, meaning sort of a superficial sense of tranquility and stability, but a stability that is sort of, purchased at the price of great injustice and oppression being, visited on a portion of the population. They prefer a negative peace, which he says is the absence of tension, over positive peace, which is the presence of justice. So again, the superficial appearance that on the surface things seem to be going okay, but underneath the surface, again, it's a system based on oppression, basically. Advises Black Americans to wait for a more convenient season. Believes they can set the timetable for another's freedom. Lukewarm acceptance, he says, is more damaging than outright rejection as well. There's a misunderstanding of peace. True peace requires justice, not merely the absence of conflict. Tension is necessary to expose and confront injustice. He does mention several white Southerners who have supported the movement. You can see a list here. I'm not going to go into it too much, but these are all people that he basically mentions at some point. He can, again, contrast this idea of extremism with nonviolence, position between two extremes within the Black community, complacency, adjusting to segregation, bitterness and hatred, which he associates with Black nationalism. Now, here's an interesting thing about King is that, King today is almost universally a beloved figure. I say almost because, there are probably still some crackpots out there that hate him, I guess. But is almost accepted on all sides. Conservatives now accept King, even though they were pretty much opposed to the civil rights movement. They now try to retroactively rewrite, history and pretend that they were in favor of it. Um, White and black and other, basically, like I said, beloved by everyone. But at the time, that was not the case, and I think in some ways it's important to sort of push back against this very sort of sanitized image of King in many ways. To recall that, at the time of his death, I mean, many whites in the United States saw him as a dangerous radical. At the same time, many younger black radicals in the United States also thought that King was too um, complacent and not radical, um, and criticized King for being very kind of bourgeois, which he was. I mean, he was college educated. He was a preacher. He had a kind of middle class existence. He was, in many ways, kind of a bourgeois. And many people would argue that King's later, post 1965 embrace of more radical causes was in many ways brought on by the criticism he was receiving from younger black radicals who would go on to form what was often called the Black Power movement. That's why, after 1965, you do see King more overtly addressing things, speaking out against the Vietnam War, talking about class injustice and economic ills in society as well. In fact, of course, many people point out, at the time that King was murdered in Memphis in 1968, he was there basically for a sanitation workers strike. So the latter phase of his career morphed into what became known as the Poor People's Campaign or the Poor People's Movement, a more specific, explicit emphasis, of course, never losing sight of racial injustice, but also more explicitly connecting these things to capitalism, to imperialism overseas, to war, to militarism. And it's particularly that sort of latter, even more radical phase of his career that even to this very day is not very often talked about. So King's relationship with the so-called Black nationalist movement, the Black Power movement, is one which was, fraught with many conflicts as well. And King oftentimes, denounced many of these radicals, not very strongly, and maybe not even that openly many times. Did he have the upper hand in the debate? I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, on some hands, like I would say, I think the younger radicals were right to push him to taking more radical attitudes. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to question of tactics and rhetoric and tone, which is a harder thing to really negotiate. And I would sort of leave that up to people to decide who had the better approach there. Anyway, King advocates for what he calls the more excellent way of love and nonviolent protest, which again, a lot of people would sort of object to this kind of, turn the other cheek attitude, mentality. Some people would say fight fire with fire. King famously said, if we apply the principle of an eye for an eye, we'll all end up blind, basically, or paraphrasing him slightly there. Examples of positive extremism, he says, again, mentions many figures from the Bible, as well as figures like Lincoln and Jefferson as well, as well as Martin Luther, who he was named after, obviously. And yes, I mean, all these figures to some extent could have been considered, extreme during their period of time, but in hindsight, seem to have been vindicated for the most part, at least. So the question, he says, is not whether to be extremist, but what kind of extremist to be, for hate or for love, for justice, for injustice or for justice. He says society needs creative extremists who pursue truth and justice. He's very critical of the praise for the Birmingham police, something which most people would not think would be happening, but it was. King challenges the praise given to the Birmingham police. Police have exercised nonviolence, he says, but only to preserve segregation and not justice. Police have violently mistreated peaceful protesters, attacking with dogs, beating elderly black citizens, denying food to prisoners for saying grace. Using moral means to protect immoral ends is unjust. And even on that score, I mean, the ideas the idea that the Birmingham police were mostly nonviolent seems to go against almost all the photographic evidence that we've seen of these protests. Um, he says, of course, again, the true heroes are the nonviolent protesters. Here again, we see scenes out of Birmingham, people sicking dogs on nonviolent protesters here. Literally ripping this guy's pants off, as you can see here, attacking this guy. Clearly, is not threatening anybody. Again, we'll look at some more of this stuff when we look at the history of the civil rights movement. It's hard imagery to look at. Wrapping up, King writes that he is hopeful about the ultimate success of the struggle for justice. Again, when we turn to the civil rights movement again later on in the class, we can critically examine more to what success the civil rights movement did ultimately have. Its actual track record is probably much more mixed at best. It did have some success, but also fell short in many ways as well, particularly in terms of greater economic securities and social rights. He believes that America's founding ideals of freedom and equality will prevail. Black Americans have endured centuries of injustice, but have remained resilient. The sacred heritage of the nation aligns with the fight for civil rights. So very, optimistic language here. The opposition will ultimately fail because the cause of justice is morally and spiritually justified. So, that more or less summarizes King's letter from Birmingham jail. But I want to, now really go into this idea more of this notion of moral law or natural law, and try to understand this concept a little bit better, because I think it critically relates to the idea of civil disobedience and generally to how we understand the concept of justice. So King argues that you are, in a sense, obligated to disobey unjust laws. And he says that unjust laws are laws that basically conflict with the natural law, or he refers to as the moral law. But he references Thomas Aquinas, and Thomas Aquinas is well known for articulating this idea of natural law, a law sort of higher than human law, a law higher than the laws passed by political bodies, basically. And he's saying that yes, when the human law comes into conflict with the natural law basically is superior, and you should follow what the natural law says, the moral law, rather than the human law, if they come into conflict. Now, I think in many ways that kind of creates sort of an insecure foundation for basing the idea of civil disobedience, as well as how we define and understand the concept of justice itself. It seems that the key idea here is, like I said, how do you tell the difference between just laws and unjust laws? Aside from fairly obvious examples, the difference between the two might not always be clear. And even back in the 1960s, for example, proponents of segregation often used religion as a way to justify segregation, and even slavery. So this idea to some sort of divinely sanctioned moral law, it really rests upon your interpretation and sort of your prior beliefs also, in many ways. And I think that relying on a concept of natural law as the basis of civil disobedience, opens yourself up to all sorts of abuses, not necessarily on the part of King or other civil rights figures, but it certainly opens the door to other people to sort of abuse this concept to support causes which most people would regard as not being just. So, for example, besides segregation, same-sex marriage is a prime example of people using religion as a way to deny people equal rights, including the right to get married. So natural law arguments are often used to oppose same-sex marriage and LGBTQ plus equality based on biological, complementary, and natural order claims. Some religious groups argue that marriage is naturally between a man and woman for procreative purposes. So, for example, there was that famous case of the county clerk in Tennessee who was arrested basically for refusing to um, sign marriage certificates. I'm trying to look up her name right now. Was it Kim Davis? I think. I believe that's what her name was. Let me double check. If I could just get my internet working here. Yeah, Kim uh, Davis was a county clerk, and was it Kentucky or Tennessee? Kentucky, who famously went to jail for refusing to sign same-sex marriage uh, certificates. And some people, in a very kind of sarcastic way, it's not meant to be a compliment at all, of course, compared her to the or reference her as being like the Rosa Parks of homophobia. Much like Rosa Parks went to jail for opposing segregation, they're saying that in her own way, she was, believing, standing up for what she believed to be right, even willing to risk jail time for it. But is that an adequate comparison? I mean, was she really standing up for justice? Was her opposition to same-sex marriage, could it really be considered civil disobedience in the way the king defines? So King's argument, so King, obviously is aware of the potential to misuse these concepts. So he does try to sketch out a little bit of what a just law is. But I would argue that even in spite of that, you're still ultimately left with something that's not quite satisfying. He says a just law is one that uplifts human personality and advances human dignity. By denying same-sex couples the right to marry, you degrade people, not uplift them, by denying them full recognition and equality under the law. Therefore, opposing same-sex marriage based on natural law contradicts the moral principle at the heart of the law, the affirmation of human dignity. Of course, you could parallel this with segregation as well. Just as segregation denied the full humanity of African Americans, denying marriage rights to same-sex couples denies their full humanity and social equality. So you could argue that despite attempts to portray it as that way, this could not be considered a legitimate act of civil disobedience, that what she was in fact doing was just like what the city authorities of Birmingham were doing, was actually disobeying a just law, not disobeying an unjust law. But again, I would still say this idea that's supposed to be uplifting and things like that, still, I think is not really a great framework for being able to differentiate between just laws and unjust laws. So how else can we sort of deal with this? So many political theorists have attempted to create a more sort of solid foundation for how we understand justice that does not necessarily rely upon the concept of natural law. And there's a lot that could be said about this, but I'll try to briefly, sketch out some aspects of the debate. One political theorist in particular, and I think is worthy of mention, is Jürgen Habermas, a German political theorist, who, rejects, as it says here, appeals to pre-political moral truths. He replaces that with this idea of what is sometimes referred to as communicative action or discourse ethics, basically debate ethics, and also this idea of what he calls democratic legitimacy. So he says that social norms, like recognition of same-sex marriage or civil rights, are valid if they are universalizable. All affected could reasonably accept them, are participatory, formed through equal, inclusive discourse, and are rationally justified based on open debate, not pre-existing order. So you can't just appeal to tradition or this is the way things have been done as a way to justify these norms. Now, and this is sort of a formal procedure, basically, for generating norms. But Habermas would also argue that not just the form, but the content, the substance of these norms would be just as well. So let's kind of try to put this to the test. This is just sort of, a thought experiment here. Um, could you reasonably expect, whether it be African Americans or LGBTQ plus people, to agree to laws that would result in segregation or, result in a denial of same-sex marriage? Hard to imagine, right? I mean, people are actually allowed to participate in these debates, and their participation actually counts, and they could, accept the consequences of these things. It would be very hard to imagine any of those laws would actually sort of pass through this formal process. So he argues that, basically by adhering to these principles, basically, that this gives you a way to sort of generate social norms or even laws. Well, laws are a little bit different. That would be rational. They would be rational because they could be, sort of reasonably accepted by people in a process of open debate. Now, notice here that the emphasis here isn't necessarily on natural law, but on, again, the process by which by which social norms are actually formed. That they have to sort of include the input of people who are affected by them, um, and that they basically have to have, a chance to add their voice to the discussion, and presumably also have a role, if we're talking about, laws and politics, to have, a voice in voting for these things as well. And if so, Habermas would argue, then you can have, it gives you a process basically for forming laws, as well as, social norms that would actually, at least approximate what we would consider to be justice, just norms, basically, just laws. So why not natural law? Well, Habermas takes more of a kind of pluralistic stance, right? No single moral order fits diverse societies. He adopts a position being, uh, of um, of neutrality regarding a religion. You can't give special, privilege or emphasis to various religious or metaphysical claims. So justice, he says, is what sort of emerges out of a rational consensus, not imposed truth. So justice is what we would agree would basically be fair for everybody, presuming that everybody has a role in saying what is fair, basically. If you exclude people or leave people out, then basically you get an unjust outcome. Mommy, again, it's very kind of a procedural kind of argument, but one which makes sense, and I think is probably a better, again, framework than just sort of relying on this idea of natural law. Another theorist who has offered an alternative to this idea is John Rawls. So justice emerges from a hypothetical original position, as he calls it, where rational agents behind the veil of ignorance, stripped of social and economic status, decide the principles of justice. Rawls's theory avoids natural law by focusing, again, on fair uh, procedures rather than pre-political moral truths. So Rawls's theory would justify racial equality and marriage equality based on principles of fairness and reciprocity rather than natural law. So Rawls is, also kind of a thought experiment. He's saying that basically, imagine you don't know anything about yourself. You don't know if you're white or black, man or woman, old or young, rich or poor, anything like. You don't know anything about yourself, and now you have to basically, decide on principles of justice for society as a whole. And he claims that if you actually did that sincerely, then of course you would agree upon, equal standards basically for everybody. And he also has a lot more to say about economic inequality as well, which is an important topic, but we're not going to concern ourselves too much with it here, especially since we've already talked about it a lot in previous classes. However, Rawls's theory, which is ironic, maybe, or maybe not so, because he is American, tends to be much more of an individualistic theory, whereas Habermas is much more focused on communication between people. What would people agree upon in an open debate, basically? Rawls is still assuming that people sort of are acting out of their own self-interest, but now they don't have any sort of identifying characteristics of what their own self-interest is. He assumes that they would not agree to things which would clearly discriminate against one group or another. And again, he's not saying that we actually do something like this, But he's just saying that if you imagine this as a kind of thought experiment, that this would be sort of like the rational outcome of it. They're similar in a lot of ways, but because of more of the emphasis on communication, I think that Habermas's approach makes a little more sense, at least to me. Um, and I think while both of them are fairly similar to what King's view is, it's not like they have outcomes here that would be significantly different than what King is talking about. I think they both provide a more solid foundation for sort of getting to these outcomes than just sort of relying on this kind of quasi or even explicitly religious concept of natural law. But there are critics even of this. One well-known critic is Michel Foucault, who writes extensively on this idea of power in society. So Foucault would critique both natural law and Habermas's discourse ethics. I'm going to focus. I'm basically going to leave Rawls aside. I'm going to focus more on Habermas here. To some extent, their ideas are very similar to each other. I tend to focus more on Habermas though. But Foucault would critique both the idea of natural law as well as Habermas's approach as products of power. So Foucault argues that justice and moral norms are shaped by systems of power and knowledge, not by moral truths or rational consensus. So segregation and opposition to same-sex marriage are not just moral failings, but manifestations of underlying power structures. So this idea of power becomes sort of the central concept in Foucault's theory. And it's very interesting in many ways. Basically, what he's saying, to a large extent, is what authorities tell you is legal, what authorities tell you is just, are not true expressions of some sort of timeless moral principles, or even fair, legislative processes, but basically are sort of expressions of sort of, the dominant power structures of society. Now, Foucault, critically, it's important to understand, is not saying that power is bad or power is something only wielded by elites. He also argues that marginalized groups also exercise power. So power becomes this very sort of, diffuse, concept that exists throughout society and sort of wielded in different ways. So again, justice is political, not universal. So completely rejects the idea of natural law, that there are some sort of universal moral truths, which is just up to people to discover through their own rationality. He says that all norms of justice or any kind of social norm is basically a reflection of political power. What counts as just reflects dominant power structures, not timeless principles, like I already said. Now, again, critically, he does say that even groups who are sort of not dominant in society are wielding power as well. So LGBTQ plus rights emerged through a struggle, not because institutions naturally evolved towards fairness, but because activists challenged norms enforced by law, medicine, and religion. So basically exercising power in a counter way, a counter narrative to sort of the dominant institutions. There is no neutral ground. Again, rejects universal justice, Habermas's rational consensus, Rawls's idea of fairness. All moral legal concepts are products of power negotiations. Justice is a struggle. Marginalized groups must resist definitions imposed by elites. For example, homosexuality as crime or mental illness. There is no alternative blueprint. Foucault doesn't prescribe a theory of justice the way in which these other theorists do. He exposes how existing systems serve power. So his role is to sort of tear the illusion away from these things and basically realize the underlying power motives that create concepts of justice and law, which is basically just become tools of social control for the most part. Again, for Foucault, justice is not a timeless ideal to be discovered, but a historically contingent outcome of power struggle, something constructed, contested, and fought over. I keep saying that because I really want the idea to sink in. Foucault argues that uh, discourse, how knowledge and truth are produced, is never neutral but shaped by power relations. So, maybe even more radically, Foucault argues even what we consider to be knowledge and truth are not just, again, neutral reflections of things that just exist out there in the world, but are shaped by power as well. Everything that we know about the world is basically um, a manifestation or a function of these different power relations that exist. The knowledge can only be produced through the sort of exercise of power. Truth and knowledge are not freely accessible through rational debate alone, as Habermas suggests. Instead, they are historically constructed by institutions and social structures. So, a couple of examples. In Foucault's landmark book, Discipline and Punish from 1975, he argues that there was a shift from public torture to what he calls disciplinary systems. So Foucault begins the book with a very vivid description of a public execution in 1757, contrasting with the modern prison timetable from the 19th century. Foucault's point was that this transformation wasn't driven by moral enlightenment or humanitarian progress. Instead, it reflected a shift in how power was exercised from sovereign power, meaning, ruling power, dramatic, violent, visible, to disciplinary power, subtle, efficient, and internalized. Modern justice systems didn't discover a better way. They developed more effective ways of controlling bodies and producing obedient subjects. So the sort of shift from public torture, which was quite common during those days, to the use of prisons as a way of controlling people doesn't reflect a more humane or more just system. For Foucault, it's just basically a better way of controlling people. Why? Because he says, well, these public executions would often provoke a backlash. People would get horrified and disgusted at what they were seeing and would rebel against the authorities. And for other reasons as well. So it was discovered that basically a better way to sort of keep people under control was to imprison them, and even under the guiding idea that we were trying to reform people as well, right? So we're not just putting people in prison because we're cruel and want to hurt these people. No, we're actually doing it for their own good, as well as for the good of society as a whole. But Foucault is saying this evolution from torture to prison doesn't represent any kind of real moral progress or anything like that. It's basically just a more effective way of controlling people. So prisons become a tool of social control. The prison became the dominant form of punishment, not because it was more just, but because it allowed for the surveillance and normalization of behavior. Foucault examines institutions like the Panopticon, a prison designed by Jeremy Bentham to show how surveillance becomes internalized. Justice is embedded in systems of control that reflect political and economic needs, for example, to produce productive workers and docile citizens, not moral insight. And of course, there's a lot of emphasis on surveillance as well. Another concept which is highly associated with Foucault, which I think would be very relevant to people now, is this idea of biopolitics or biopower and the management of populations. So Foucault, again, traces how sovereign power, the right to take life or let live, gave way to what he calls biopower, a form of governance concerned with regulating life, health, birth rates, and longevity. So again, where we associate sort of the older form of power with coercive force of power, again, executions, wars, things like that. This gave way eventually to a form of a governance, as he says, that is more concerned with regulating the life of people, increasing the population, mainly for the interest of producing more workers and productive workers. But in our post-COVID world, I would think people would be very concerned with things like this, and certainly are. I mean, whether the skepticism over vaccines and things like that is justified, certainly it relates to things like this. That the government is more interested now in sort of regulating our lives and our health in ways in which they weren't previously. This gave rise to laws and policies in the name of public health, race, hygiene, including eugenics and national strength, not moral reasoning. So again, none of these ideas were a product of some sort of moral evolution on the part of authorities. They were basically motivated by the need to more effectively control people, as well as to more, again, produce more and more bodies which could be of use in economics as well, to produce wealth and value through their labor or labor power. Concepts of justice, for example, who deserves protection or punishment, were shaped by state interest in managing populations, not by universal ethics. Okay, I think that's somewhat clear. The idea that politics is a continuation of war by other means. Inverting Clausewitz, Foucault argues that political and legal institutions encode the result of past wars, victories of one group over another, like colonial powers over colonized peoples. Law then is not a neutral arbiter of justice, but a weapon that reflects historical domination. Justice systems preserve the power of the victors, wrapped in the language of neutrality and fairness. So Foucault's approach, I think, has a lot to lend itself to people. I think a lot of people would resonate with a lot of people, especially this idea of sort of exposing the supposed impartiality of laws and concepts of justice, and sort of exposing the real interests that are being served by these things. However, there are sort of key questions that emerge from this as well. Is Foucault, for example, too cynical? Does Foucault's emphasis on power perhaps overstate the difficulty of achieving fair discourse? Because Foucault's approach doesn't just sort of argue for this on the part of authorities, but again, it's sort of expanded to society as a whole. So nobody's really genuinely motivated by truth and justice. Almost all conflicts basically become just this sort of contest of different power struggles, essentially, on the part of people. And he also states that it's almost if not actually impossible for people to truly have an open debate or discussion that isn't sort of influenced by the underlying power dynamics that exist. And maybe that is ultimately true, but are you at least able to reduce those power dynamics to a very small level? If all discourse or debate is basically power driven, does that mean progress is impossible? So I think of the song lyric from the 1970s, "Meet the new boss, same as the old boss." I mean, that seems to be kind of the sentiment here. And it's interesting. This song by the Who is from 1971. Foucault is writing this book in 1975. Both these works, sort of represent this kind of post-60s disillusionment that happened after the 60s. In other words, the 60s, particularly the late 1960s, were filled with all this optimism. Things are changing. Things are getting better. And then things didn't significantly change or get better. People seem to get very demoralized by that. That certainly seems to be expressed in the song lyric here. Certainly, historically, you would maybe relate this to things like the Soviet Union, perhaps, which people thought would represent a change from what came before it. And then, granted, conditional on your political views, many people would argue that the Soviet Union did not represent a significant change. It just represented a new power elite, a new group coming into power, wielding power over the working class. Well, not everybody agrees with that. Foucault often, sort of gets lumped into that kind of post-60s disillusionment, though, which may or may not be fair. I'm sure people who are strongly, committed to a Foucaultian point of view don't like that argument. Although it's hard, to completely overlook the historical context of when he's making these arguments as well. Anyway, the question still remains, even if you can't, completely get rid of power imbalances, can you at least reduce them in a significant way? So this kind of leads us back to Habermas, who's writing most of his mature work, sort of comes from the 1980s and afterwards. His response would be that even if perfect neutrality is unattainable, discourse ethics, again, sort of the rules of debate, essentially, the sort of rational rules of how we should debate, helps reduce coercion. So Foucault's great contribution is sort of, unmasking power, sort of realizing that behind the surface appearance of impartiality and neutrality, there are, interests at play. I mean, you could argue that Habermas's approach kind of does the same thing by sort of, stipulating what are the conditions for having a rational debate, that gives us a framework where we can say, well, are those conditions actually being met in actual debates? And if not, and of course, in most cases they are not, it also gives us an alternative way of sort of unmasking power as well. So Habermas acknowledges that these power imbalances exist, but argues that rational communication can help overcome them. His discourse ethics emphasize creating conditions where all voices, especially those of oppressed groups, can participate freely and equally. What he also refers to as the ideal speech situation, again, where these, principles of participation and universal participation, universalizability. I have a bit of a hard time getting that word out sometimes. Is a goal, not a claim that, of course, actual discussions going on between groups is actually, meeting that goal. But like I said a moment ago, if we use that as the standard by which to judge things, if we find situations which are clearly violating that, in other words, excluding people, marginalizing people, not allowing, groups who are, affected by something to have their say in what is going on, then that is also in its own way a way of unmasking power as well. Historically, we've seen through the 1960s, the social movements and reforms do create fairer, more inclusive dialogues over time as well. So can we reframe Foucault in a certain way? Foucault shows that oppressed groups resist by mobilizing power, not by appealing to timeless truths. Again, so the idea of natural law is completely thrown out here. But resistance can produce new norms, more inclusive, participatory, and justice-oriented. These outcomes often echo Habermas's ideals of dialogue, consensus, and mutual recognition, even if Foucault himself remains skeptical of universal foundations. So I would argue that, Habermas argues that there is a formal process, sort of, rules by which you go about conducting a debate. But he's also saying that, the outcome of that debate will also produce moral values and social norms, which we could say actually fulfills or meets the criteria of what would be considered just. So, sort of an equal standard applied to everyone. And I think in terms of, the content of these things, I mean, if you actually look at, historically what these social movements have been asking for, I mean, aren't it, isn't it things like that? I mean, isn't it inclusion, participation, and things like that? So I would argue that Foucault says a lot of things, but he doesn't really say a lot, and intentionally does not want to say what these new norms should be. What Habermas is advocating for seems to actually be, the content or the substance of what these movements are actually asking for. So in that way, I would think that Habermas is in many ways even closer to King certainly than Foucault, but even according to many other thinkers as well, even if he kind of rejects this idea of natural law. Anyway, bringing this idea back to King, I mean, I think this would be a good way to sort of ground the idea of civil disobedience and the idea of justice, which in turn, underpins the idea of civil disobedience. If we sort of apply that process, besides examining the power relations that are served by these things, can we actually then specify conditions, or can we use that as a guiding principle here that both debates as well as the outcomes of these debates should be predicated on the idea that everyone involved has a voice in these debates. And if there are any obvious exclusions here, then the outcome of those debates cannot be valid. I mean, we see this now. What's going on with Israel? I mean, clearly attempts to criticize Israel are being met with basically, the criminalization of free speech in many instances, attempts to shut down the debate by any criticism of Israel at all as being labeled anti-Semitic. I mean, these are not ways in which you sort of open the debate in a more inclusive way. It actually goes against all of that. And, again, I mean, you've seen the way in which actual authorities do try to silence debate. I mean, you could take a cynical view and say, like, well, okay, so what? So more people have a voice. Who cares? It's not going to change anything. Well, if anything, as we see how these things actually play out, that authorities are actually concerned about that and do try to silence a debate. And when you do actually force things to open up that way, it can have a profound effect as well. It's sort of a table kind of summarize a lot of what I've just been talking about. Now, how does this respond to law, though? So, a lot of what Habermas talks about seems to, depend upon the idea of a consensus. The people that norms are only just basically if people can more or less agree on them, or if not agree on them, at least participate in a fair a process of forming these laws. And the process of norms. And the process of forming laws follows a similar way. But Habermas is forced to, acknowledge, of course, that true consensus is not possible in most instances. Even going back to social norms, we know quite clearly that not everybody agrees on same-sex marriage. Not everybody even agrees on racial equality. So if these things depend upon a consensus, can we really let a small minority basically block progress? I mean, Habermas would say no. Although that is a common criticism raised against him, he does seem to deflect that criticism, or actually, answer that criticism. Unfortunately, I would also have to point out that you can read Habermas's, who's still alive. Foucault unfortunately died in 1984, so unfortunately did not have much of a chance to respond to Habermas's, particularly in his post 1980s period or 1980s and after. It would have been interesting to see how the evolving debate between these two would have played out. Foucault was still, mostly critical, of course, of Habermas, even up until the end. Habermas, who's still alive now and in his 90s, has released statements about October 7th and things like that. And unfortunately, I would say his response has been very disappointing, to say the very least. I'll leave it up to people to search it out if you're curious. I don't know if he said anything more recently, but he did release a statement in the very aftermath of October 7th, which I would say was a very disappointing statement. It seems to be almost a betrayal of his very ideas here. But anyway, um, he would say that both laws and social norms, yes, I mean, if true consensus is not possible, at least you have a fair process, he says, of determining these things, which is, again, openness, inclusivity, and especially in the case of laws, through majority rule. So when true consensus is impossible, then in many cases you're sort of forced back upon majority rule for the most part. Now you can't let majorities decide everything either. So this becomes a more complicated argument regarding courts and legal systems and how we define fundamental rights, which are not subject to democratic. A majority can't just vote to take away people's civil rights, for example. I mean, there's a lot to be said, and I can only sort of sketch out briefly what the main points here. But here I think that while I may seem to be mostly on the side of Habermas, here I think that in many ways Habermas is aside from what I just said about his stance on Israel, here I think that Habermas's political theory in particular tends to fall short, and that he ultimately seems to more or less endorse current political institutions as pretty much a good approximation of these principles of inclusiveness and communicative action and things like that. And it just seemed very hard to hold to that in the present day, where we see quite clearly the dysfunctional nature of democratic governments throughout the world. Now, I guess to be fair, you would say, well, Habermas is, first of all, he's a German, not an American. So the idea of social rights and economic equality, progressed much further there after World War II than it has in the United States. He's also writing mostly in the 1980s, where things maybe were not as bad as they were now. But even that I would consider to be a fairly weak uh, defense of Habermas's argument. Certainly, there were certainly warning signs there. And there were all sorts of conflicts playing out back then as well. I mean, in many ways, sometimes I refer to Habermas as being sort of like the ultimate defender of the status quo. That when all is said and done, but with all these complicated theories, and if this seems complicated, try actually reading Habermas, who's one of the most complicated thinkers that you can read. For all the complexity and hundreds of pages that you have to read to understand him, I mean, essentially ends up more or less defending the status quo, that the current day political institutions, largely approximate this idea of fairness. I mean, obviously he is for social change and what was himself involved in various social movements during this period of time. He also argues that current day democracies have kind of corrective mechanisms built into them, where even if things aren't sort of proceeding in a fair and democratic fashion, there's a way to sort of counteract that. There's a way in which things kind of course correct over time. I find these arguments very hard. These arguments very hard to defend in today's world. I mean, if there are corrective mechanisms in democratic governments, as he defines them to be, I mean, when exactly are these mechanisms going to kick into gear? When are these mechanisms going to start working? Because it seems like everything is getting worse, not getting better. And not just the United States, but various other countries seem to be more and more, descending now into economic inequality, and political authoritarianism seems to be on the rise in many of these countries, including Germany as well. So I don't know. So on that regard, maybe I won't say I'm more sympathetic to Foucault, but I'm certainly more sympathetic, I would say, to a Marxist point of view, which, funny enough, both Foucault and Habermas sort of exist in tension with Marxist theory. But I certainly think that the idea of states sort of existing to sort of serve the dominant economic interests certainly seems to be the reality that we see playing on here. It'd be interesting to see how both of their theories could fit into that. I sometimes argue that their theories, Foucault and Habermas, that is aren't as antithetical or contradictory to Marxist theory as some people might think. I know people like David Harvey has argued that specifically in relation to Foucault. I mean, certainly you could argue debates on economic inequality certainly seem to exclude, the voices of workers and things like that. So there's that Habermasian aspect to it as well. I think there might be some, potential there for bringing, incorporating their best insights into these things. But I do tend to think that Foucault tends to reduce everything to power, and that does kind of undermine progressive change to a large extent. He doesn't really say much about where we should be heading, and I think you can say that under some circumstances. I think Habermas does get closer to saying that, but his sort of endorsement of liberal democracy, or sort of the democratic institutions that we see before us for the most part are very underwhelming, to say the least. And if I could be crude here, I mean, sort of have all the impact of a wet fart, basically. Despite reading, again, investing so much time into reading what his theories are, and realizing that basically becomes this defense of the status quo is very underwhelming, to say the least. That being said, again, relaying this back to King, maybe I'm straying too far here from what we were originally talking about, but I do think that you have to have something better than just this idea of natural law to replace civil, to sort of underpin the idea of civil disobedience, as well as the concept of justice in a general sense as well. I do think that Habermas's ideas have some role to play there. I think he's obviously limited in other ideas. I think probably the best way to approach this is through a Marxist lens, which also appropriates sort of the best insights from both Foucault and Habermas as well. All right, so I'll probably start to wrap things up here. I mean, some closing thoughts. I mean, in the learning module for this class, I've also included part of the debate between Noam Chomsky and Foucault, which I would encourage people to look at. Chomsky sort of serves as kind of a substitute or a surrogate or a stand-in basically for Habermas here, and he debates Foucault on a lot of these issues, including ideas of justice and civil disobedience and things like that, which I think is very illuminating. I won't really get a chance to talk about it here, but I'll try to include a link for it in our class as well. I'd also encourage people to check out the King graphic novel by Ho-Che Anderson, which I think is very interesting to look at as well. If I had more time, I'd try to go through some of it in class now, but I want to kind of wrap things up here. All right, so that's it. So take care, everyone.